When I first came to America in 1960, one of the first people I went to see was Roland. I'd met him in Europe, and he'd have told me, when you come to New York, come and see me. And to my amazement, I went to the top floor of the building on 57th Street, Old Nerdler's, and there were Roland and Carmen Mesmer putting. They were practicing their putting on the corridor. And then Carmen started telling me a whole string of absolutely filthy jokes which had horrified Jock Whitney, but had very much amused his sister Joan, who would never buy paintings from anybody else. Jock couldn't stand him. But Roland, immediately we saw a lot of each other, and in those days, for various reasons, I used to go and see a strange old lady called Helena Rubinstein, who had rather a good collection, but she didn't know what she had. And in a sort of old clothes closet, I found 6 Juan Gris large cartoons. And I went to tell her what they were. And she said, absolute nonsense, they're fakes, they're fake Marcuse. Anyway, cut a long story short, Roland and I bought them. And the only problem was, she wanted to be paid in cash, and we had to sit on her lucite bed, endlessly counting what X $1,000, and it always came out wrong each time. So we'd have to do this again and again and again. Anyway, that was the beginning, and then later on, Roland told me that there were problems at Nerdler's with somebody who was working for Nerdler's called Xavier Fourcade, who rather wanted to become head of Nerdler's himself. And so in a bid to unseat Roland, he managed to get Nerdler's current bank thing into rather a mess. I mean, Nerdler's couldn't pay Henry Moore what they'd been paying him. And instead of Xavier Fourcade and his backers moving in to take over Nerdler's, Dr. Hammer stepped in and bought it. And Jack got me to work with them. And Roland and Dr. Hammer were an amazing couple. I mean, Roland couldn't stand Dr. Hammer, but he thought him this amazing sort of Russian clown, and a lot of jokes were had at his expense. By this time, Dali was under contract and supposed to produce a show every 2 years. Well, he couldn't. I mean, his hand was too shaky, his eyes too weak for the fine work. So, as we heard earlier, he had these, what were these things called holograms, which had nothing, which Dali hadn't done much for. I mean, he had the idea, but he didn't make them. We had to find some original Dalis. So Roland and I went down into the basement of Nerdler's, and we found a lot of old 19th century pieces of sculpture of no great distinction, and Dali got somebody to paint some ants on it, and we bought loaves of bread and all kinds of surrealist cliches, and we turned them into very saleable Dalis. And the show, I was horrified, so was Roland. I mean, that people should buy this dreck, but they did. Then what Roland didn't have to do, which I had to do, was to go to Portligat and try to work things out with Dali, which was relatively easy with him. But Gala would always dig you in the ribs with her elbow and say, more money, more money. And I'd say, but Dali hasn't given us any paintings. I don't mind about that, more money. And so this was painful. And so when I got back, Rollo and I went and had dinner with Dali and Gala. And Dali started off, I can't remember, it wasn't the Grenouille, but one of those restaurants. And Dali started off by saying, we want a magnum of Lafitte 1939. Now, were it available, I mean, it would have cost $50,000, but I mean, and apparently he did this every time in restaurants. He'd always ask for some incredibly grandiose bottle of wine, and then you'd end up with something less grandiose. So that was one thing. Then another very enjoyable thing that Roland and I did was to bring Warhol into Nerdler's. And I'd done a deal with Andy that we and Lord, my mind's going, Leo Castelli, should buy up all the Mao Zedong paintings, which were a huge amount. And this was very successful indeed. I had a lot of them in my office, and I remember Roland coming in one day, and we tried to work out why they looked so different from anything else. And Roland said, they're not real paintings. Somehow they don't have the heft. They're not palpable like usual paintings are. And we decided that they looked as if they came from a studio on Mars. I mean, they had this totally unreal thing, but they were marvelous in their own way, and we sold a huge amount of them and had a show of them in Paris, where there was a reception, which, Jack, I'm sure you remember, at the Crillon, which was rather dramatic, because in those days, Roland had a girlfriend, and she thought that we were in Paris, and she thought that she would be very much sort of Queen of the May, but she wasn't, because Felice had come into the picture, and there were terrible, terrible dramas and rows, and in the middle of all this, Roland sat serenely, smiling through it all, having occasional drink, and all was well. When I first came, when I was first at Nördler's, and became a friend of Nördler's, I'd go out on the town quite a bit, and so often older, more attractive women would ask me what I did, and I'd say, well, I work at Nördler's. Do you know Roland Balay? Yes. And then a kind of dreamy look would come into their eyes, and they'd say, oh, I haven't seen him in 20 years. He was such fun. He had such a good eye. And he was so naughty. And indeed, Roland did have a naughty boy side, but it was so, how can I describe it? So festive, so such, that it never really, people remembered his little coups with delight. And I remember this famous story of Roland going into, I can't remember, was it the Crillon bar? And very, very politely, he just drank everybody's drink down the bar. But very politely, m'excusez, oh, merci. And so went down the line and drank every single drink. And then there was another time, which, Jack, I'm sure you remember, which was in the Pléiade, where we all used to go and eat in those days. And Roland had a drink too many and suddenly got up from the table and went into the kitchen. Nobody knows what happened, but 3 minutes later, the entire kitchen staff came rushing out of the kitchen, screaming, yelling with their pots and pans, and went out of the door, followed by Roland shrieking with laughter. Anyway, fortunately, at this point, Felice came into his life and made him happier than he'd ever been. I'll never forget that wedding, which was so touching, and made, as I say, made Roland so happy. And his last 30 years were an absolute paradise, and we should all be so lucky.